Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 We're at chapter 15, text 13. I enter into each planet, and by my energy they stay in orbit. I become the moon and thereby supply the juice of life to all vegetables. Here's the purport. It is understood that all the planets are floating in the air only by the energy of the Lord. The Lord enters into every atom, every planet, and every living being. That is discussed in the Brahma Samhita. It is said there that one plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma, enters into the planets, the universe, the living entities, and even into the atom. So due to his entrance, everything is appropriately manifested. When the spirit soul is there, a living man can float on the water. But when the living spark is out of the body, and the body is dead, the body sinks. Of course, when it is decomposed, it floats just like straw and other things. But as soon as the man is dead, he at once sinks in the water. Similarly, all the planets are floating in space, and this is due to the entrance of the supreme energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. His energy is sustaining each planet, just like a handful of dust. If someone holds a handful of dust, there is no possibility of the dust's falling. But if one throws it in the air, it will fall down. Similarly, these planets, which are floating in the air, are actually held in the fist of the universal form of the Supreme Lord. By his strength and energy, all moving and non-moving things stay in their place. It is said in the Vedic hymns that because of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the sun is shining and the planets are steadily moving. Were it not for him, all the planets would scatter like dust in the air and perish. Similarly, it is due to the Supreme Personality of Godhead that the moon nourishes all vegetables. Due to the moon's influence, the vegetables become delicious. Without the moonshine, the vegetables can neither grow nor taste succulent. Human society is working, living comfortably, and enjoying food due to the supply from the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, mankind could not survive. The word rasatmakaha is very significant. Everything becomes palatable by the agency of the Supreme Lord through the influence of the moon. So the verse again. I enter into each planet, and by my energy they stay in orbit. I become the moon, and thereby supply the juice of life to all vegetables. So this chapter is called mysteriously the Yoga of the Supreme Person. So this chapter is in many ways describing important things about the Supreme Person. So the first 5 verses of this chapter, 1 through 5, basically discuss how one can get free from materialism or from the material view by explaining a very mysterious metaphor called the banyan tree. So the first 5 verses talk about the banyan tree. And it's a huge tree which strangely has roots up and leaves and twigs down instead of the way that most trees are. Of course, that's understood to be a reflection. So when you see the reflection of a tree in the water, the roots are up and the branches and leaves are down. So the banyan tree is like that. And it also has roots going down as well as roots going up. So this tree is very mysterious, and it's very convoluted, and it's very dark. So anyone in the tree naturally gets lost and bewildered along the way. And this is why in not just India, but many cultures, especially Oriental culture, this idea of coming out of the forest, or nirvana is there, Nir is not or out, and vana is forest, out of the forest. So we are getting out of the forest. And this means that our intelligence and understanding of the world around us is becoming clear and one-pointed and simple, as opposed to being murky, dark, confused, and multiple exposured. So that's the way that we generally look at things. So the first 5 verses are about that. And then from 6 to 11, we hear about the whole process of reincarnation, not in a detailed, specific way, but in kind of a basic overview. Krishna talks about that. And then 12 through 15, which is this group of verses we're talking about today, Krishna explains to Arjuna how he is the maintainer of everything. So everything comes from Krishna. And Krishna, during the Bhagavad-gita, in several places in the Bhagavad-gita, he suddenly explains how things come from him. Everything comes from him. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then 16, 17, and 18 are called the 3 sloka Gita of knowledge, which we hear about fallible and infallible living entities, and then the supreme infallible. And finally, the last 2, 19 and 20, are how if one knows Krishna, one knows everything. So that's a overview of this entire chapter, and we're kind of in the middle of it. And we're hearing how Krishna is the source of everything. Everything comes from him. And someone who tries to trace out how everything comes from Krishna is a person who will actually begin to gain clarity of how the world works. However, a person who will not make that final step towards understanding the Supreme Lord, such a person will never have clarity. Although they may have abundant, detailed knowledge about things, they will never actually have clarity. And this is described in a very interesting way in Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 2nd canto, 9th chapter, where we hear this mysterious chatur sloka, or nutshell verses of Srimad Bhagavatam. The Bhagavad-gita also has 4 nutshell verses. In other words, we could compress the Bhagavad-gita into 4 verses only. And we can compress the entire Bhagavatam, which is much larger. Bhagavad-gita is 700 verses. Srimad Bhagavatam is 18,000 verses. So we could compress the entire Bhagavatam into 4 slokas. And that's called the nutshell slokas of Srimad Bhagavatam. And they're in the 2nd canto, 9th chapter, and they're verse 33, 34, 35, and 36. And one of those verses, Krishna says to Brahma, he's speaking to the first being in the universe. So when Krishna sets up the universe, first, all the universes manifest from the body of Mahavishnu, as we're hearing here. All these planets float. So similarly, all the universes float in the causal ocean. And in each universe, Krishna again expands as one part of Mahavishnu, called Garbha-Vishnu. And from that Garbha-Vishnu, and there's one in each of the myriads of universes, that Mahavishnu generates Brahma. And Brahma is the first living being in each universe, and he is the engineer of the universe. He gets the tools, the energies, and he begins to give shape to the universe. And so in the beginning of the universe, Brahma is confused about what to do and where he is and what's going on. So he meditates on his lotus flower, and the Supreme Lord appears to him. And it mentions in the second canto, the Supreme Lord appears to him and shows him the spiritual world, the Vaikuntha planets, and then shakes his hand. So it's interesting that it makes that important point that the Supreme Lord shakes Brahma's hand. And then after shaking his hand, he tells him these 4 verses. And the second one of the verses, which I'm focusing now, he says that anything in this universe which appears to be of substance but has no connection to me, know that to be my illusory energy, or that shadow, or that light which is reflected in the shadows. Anything in this universe that appears to be of substance but is not related to me, know that to be my illusory energy, or the light reflected in shadow. So this is what my point is here, that to understand the Supreme Lord, or understand the world, we have to connect it to the Supreme Lord. If we don't go that last step of connecting it to the Supreme Lord, then whatever we have will be like a, dandelion blowing on the wind, or like a group of insects fallen off a tree in the water, just kind of bobbing around and going nowhere and not connected to anything. And this gets at the striking and fundamental differences between the way generally people in the modern world look at the world that we live in, and the Vedic perspective of the world, the way the people that were cultivating spiritual knowledge, the way they looked at the world. These two worldviews are poles apart, but they can be described in a couple of simple ways, in what way they strikingly differ. And the first way we can say that they strikingly differ is that within the Vedas, everything is finally connected up to the Supreme Lord, who is a person, the Supreme Lord Krishna. Everything is ultimately connected up to him. Whereas in our modern world, nothing is connected to the Supreme Lord. Everything is divorced from the Supreme Lord. And it's considered to be philosophically soft-headed to try to connect things, that last step, to the Supreme Lord. Rather, we connect things to atoms or to various forces. And everybody leaves it there because these things are material, and we have some kind of faith in this kind of outlook. So this is the striking difference, that as that second verse, the 2.9.34 says, whatever appears to be of substance, if it is not connected to me, know that to be my illusory energy, or that reflection which is in the darkness. So this is also in the Sri Ishopanishad. We hear that there is nescience and knowledge side by side. We should study what knowledge is, and we should study what ignorance is, or nescience and knowledge side by side. And the actual fundamental definition of nescience is any structure of understanding which does not ultimately connect to the Supreme. And that's a simple definition of the definition of ignorance. And of course, our modern world is very steeped in this way of looking at things. And it's not a recent event. This way of looking at the world is something that has gradually come about and gradually been cultivated over at least 2,000, 3,000 years. That our whole Western society has come to more and more think about things in a certain methodology, in a certain way. And this methodology in a certain way has led us down the road to a very dry, mechanistic, and atheistic view of things. But there is no evidence that such a view is actually practical or, for that matter, has any power of explanation. And that's the thing that is interesting if we look at it. One of the things that we can see that really stands out between the modern view, the materialistic view, and the Vedic view, or the theistic, God-centered view, is that we have faith in the law maker, and modern people have faith in the law. So if you listen to the way modern intellectuals speak, way people speak on television or in high society, in some kind of cultured circles, or the way scientific or academics speak, they always resort to laws. And for them, the laws are as fundamental as it gets. You don't go any further beyond the laws. The laws are it. They're the bottom line. They are the final bedrock of reality. But we don't think that way. We think that the laws come from a lawgiver. So we go one more step from the laws to the lawgiver. And we understand that at any time, since the lawgiver gives the laws, he can turn them off if he wants to. He's not subject to them. He's the one that created them. This is kind of simple, but I'll try to make some examples in a minute. And you can begin to see how our modern thinking is shaped by this view that the bottom of everything are laws. So there are certain modern tendencies in the way people look at things. And as an acronym, I created one called Rabid Men Squared, which kind of seems somehow bizarrely appropriate. So the R in rabid stands for reductionistic, A stands for atheistic, B stands for behavioristic, I is impersonalistic, and D is deterministic. And the men squared means there's two M's, two E's, and two N's. So the two M's are materialistic and mechanistic. The two E's are evolutionary and epiphenomenal. And the two N's are naturalistic and numerical. So this is the way our modern world looks at things. Rabid men squared. So it's not that all of these tendencies and thinking are completely wrong. Of course, some are. Some are as wrong as things get. Like atheism is always wrong, as we just discovered. That whenever you bite in and consider yourself an atheist or want to focus as that way of looking at things, you are, by definition, going to drift away. You can talk nicely. People may invite you on talk shows. You may be able to deliver wonderful lectures. You may get paid. You may hold high positions in academia or in scientific circles. But you will have no real view of the world because you haven't gone that last step. You believe in the laws, but not the lawgiver. And you go as far as trying to resolve things to a bedrock of laws that you assume are somehow inexorable and unviolable. But actually they're both. They can be changed. And they, in fact, even according to scientific estimations, they change to some extent. There's a scientist named Rupert Sheldrake that, when we look at the stock market or we look at the gross national product, we expect it to kind of fluctuate a little bit, that one year we have a good year, one year we have a bad year, or, with the stock market, one stock may be going up, another may be going down. But when we talk about the speed of light, we think that's a constant. But Rupert Sheldrake did some research and found out that the speed of light is slowing down. So, that's bizarre. So he went in England to some royal society that's the head of bureaus of standards, and he asked the man there, he said, I have looked at scientific literature over several years, and I have plotted on a graph the discovered speed of light. Usually we think of it as 186,000 miles per second, and that's a ballpark figure, but they take it out to a few more decimal places. And this number, he said, I put a graph on it, and even within the same year and within the same group of people, there's a fluctuation, but it's gradually going down. Speed of light is slowing down. So he asked him, what's up with that? And the man who was the Bureau of Standards, he said, oh dear, you have discovered something that is very embarrassing. And he said, it appears that our methods are getting better, and therefore we're getting closer to the actual speed of light. And Rupert Sheldrake said, well, could it be it's actually changing? And he said, no, it can't be changing. It's a constant. So this is how our world is based. A certain category of thinking, a certain trend of thinking, boils everything down to some kind of mechanical, mathematical principles that never change under any circumstances, and as long as we can get to them and boil everything down to them, we feel safe and we feel warm and fuzzy inside. And this is kind of interesting, because this is nothing more really than a prejudice or just a behaviorism of modern thinking. There's nothing that there's no evidence you can give that the speed of light or any of these constants never change, nor is there any evidence that we can give that these formulas that scientists use never change. But somehow we have to hold on to something. So if we're going to throw God away, then we got to hold on to these, because the human mind cannot stand to live in absolute chaos. We have to have some sense of order. And again, if that sense of order doesn't go the final step to God, or it goes to the laws and not the lawmaker, then we will have some problem. We will be able to maybe form a nice rational system, but it will have some flaws in it, and we will never be able to actually understand the deep nature of things. So there is a phenomenon, we were talking about it this morning, because I was giving class at Bhakti Center, and they're in the 6th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, and Prabhupada was talking about how people chase after material life like a will-o'-the-wisp. And this was an idea that I've heard a number of times, or a word that I've heard a number of times. And I wonder, what in the world is this will-o'-the-wisp? And evidently, in swampy areas at night, people apparently see lights. And this is not a recent phenomenon. Of course, it does happen in the modern day, but it's been going on since time immemorial. And people have written about it. There's literature in many of the countries of the world, and there's a whole sort of folklore about it, about what these lights are. In Ireland, it's this man who did a pact with the devil or something like that. Other places, it's fairies that have them, or, all these kind of things. What is this? And the bizarre thing about these lights at night is that when you go towards one of these will-o'-the-wisps, it appears to retreat from you. And so you can never actually get to it. You just go farther and farther, and it appears to go farther and farther away. If you give up and start walking away from it, it follows you back. And many people have tried to investigate this phenomenon. And of course, nowadays, again, these people who have faith in the laws and all that, they claim this is swamp gas that somehow spontaneously ignites, that bacteria in the swamp water create methane and other things, and somehow this ignites. But this is one of those kind of grasping at straws sort of explanations, because it doesn't explain how the light appears to move away. And generally when something burns, it has a little bit of a sound to it. And if it burns, you could imagine it would probably catch something on fire. And that usually isn't the case. So what is this? It's one of those many things in our world that are common phenomenon and even written about in literature, from Shakespeare to ancient folklore of every kind. These things get written about, and they point to the fact that there are some things that don't seem to follow our sacred scientific laws. And so therefore there's a certain class of people who have to come up with some materialistic, mechanistic explanation of such things. And so this is the way our world works. And we begin to see, that starting with my bizarre acronym, that reductionism is this idea that everything boils down to simpler things. And of course, reductionism isn't all wrong. As a matter of fact, that's what Sankhya does. It takes the material universe and breaks it down into 24 elements. So yes, some things can be spoken about as aggregates of smaller, simpler components. And that's a valid way of researching some kind of things. And when somebody explains something, what counts as an explanation is sometimes decomposing a complex thing into small parts and showing how they interact. And that counts as an explanation. So, but to do that everywhere at all times, and to think that everything must ultimately resolve into simple things, is one of those things that the more you do, the more ludicrous it gets, because some things refuse that approach. Some things resist that approach. And they cannot be talked about as reducing to smaller things. If we talk about the universe, again we see this is the whole mindset of the scientific view, that the world must reduce to very simple things. In fact, sometimes people talk about gut and toe. And probably some of you have heard of gut and toe. Gut is grand unified theory, and toe is theory of everything. So we have to have a good gut and a good toe. And theory of everything is supposed to be a scientific, mechanistic explanation of the entire world around us. And a grand unified theory is supposed to be, a grand unified theory is supposed to be one theory that pulls everything together and makes it one homogeneous idea. But of course, there is no gut and there is no toe. Although certainly scientists have been working on it for a while, but they haven't come up with a gut or a toe. So, at any rate, this sounds like it could get smelly if it goes too far. But at any rate, people are looking for the gut and toe that explains everything by pulling everything together into one thing. But we see that if we try to reduce everything to one thing, what would that be? And sometimes scientists say one day we'll have the theory of all kinds of matter and energy in a single equation that you can write on a t-shirt. And so that way everything will be simple. But of course, when you go to any scientific college and you go to hear them speak, they'll say that the universe works by simple laws, and then they proceed to fill up hundreds of blackboards with derivations of all the details of these laws. So it isn't really simple. Anything is simple if you just look at it at the 60,000 foot view, but that doesn't satisfy us. We want to know the matrix of how it works together. So the scientists talk about atoms and about energy, and they say everything resolves to one of these two things, matter and energy. However, this matter and energy, what is it? When we ask the question, well, what is an atom? And scientists will say, oh, we know what an atom is. It's made out of, protons and neutrons, and on the outside are dancing some electrons. And then, well, what are protons, neutrons, and electrons? Well, we know what that is. They are these things called quarks, and quarks come in triplets. So 2 up quarks and a down quark is one kind, 2 down quarks and an up quark is another thing, and this and that and the other. Well, what are quarks? And then we got now into string theory, and we start saying that they're strings. But what are strings? And we keep asking the question, and the will of the wisp seems to be moving somehow farther and farther away from us. But what is it? And if you ask a Vedic scholar or someone who understands Vedic literature, they'll say the final answer is, it's the energy of the Supreme. That's where the buck stops. It's the energy of the Supreme. And Krishna's energies are multifarious, and they can do anything. However, generally, he has them do one characteristic item, and that's what the scientists know, and that's what they study, and that's what they feel comfortable with. Parasya Shaktir Vividaya Shruyate. So, out of many energies, Krishna has many energies. He has external, internal, and marginal energies. And the external energy is designed to appear dead. This stuff, matter. And so matter is the external energy. It is the energy of Krishna. And this external energy is everywhere. It's all around us. We live in it, we walk in it, we do all kinds of things in it. And this energy is not conscious, and it does nothing on its own, which is what Prabhupada's saying in this particular verse, that the external energy is not able to conceive of anything, it has no purpose, it's not able to move on its own. Rather, something that is alive has to do some moving of it. So therefore, this external energy, these atoms, are ultimately the Supreme Lord. And we get to, how did this universe actually get created? Well, it starts off with energies of the Supreme Lord, and then Brahma gives them some shape. And how does he do that? He uses mantras, and through mantras things act in a certain way, and so therefore the Supreme Lord says, if you use this mantra, I will have my energy act in this very specific way. And of course, if the Supreme Lord wants, he can have it stop acting in that particular way. So now we look at 2,000 years of Western history of first philosophy, and then finally evolving into what we today call science, trying to come to grips with this. And these energies are the Supreme Lord's energies. And so he can make things hot, he can make them cold, he can make them wet, he can make them dry, he can make them behave in the same way every day, most of the time. And he can make them stop behaving that way at any time, at any place, any time he wants to. So the planets are there, and generally we think of the universe as being this cosmic desert with mostly nothing, and we have some rocks and dust floating around, and some of it burns, and we call it a sun, and it's just swirling around. We don't know where it's going. We hope it doesn't collide. We know it does sometimes. And what will it do in the long run? We don't know. And we got here because of evolution and this and that and the other. All these explanations are the modern way of looking at things. But the Supreme Lord is actually entering into every atom, and that's what we call, his Brahman feature. He enters into the heart of every living entity. That's what we call his Paramatma feature. And he also maintains his own status as an individual, and that's called the Bhagavan feature. So these three features are one aspect of a unified entity, the Supreme Lord, who is everywhere. And everything comes from him. So whatever you say or whatever you think about the Supreme Lord, it is coming from him. Anything you see, anything you say, anything you think of, it has its source in him. All opposites have their source in him. So therefore, Supreme Lord is apparently contradictory because everything comes from him. Up comes from him, down comes from him, in comes from him, out comes from him, big comes from him, small comes from him, good comes from him, evil comes from him. Everything comes from him. So everything is generated by the Supreme Lord. So therefore he is logically the reservoir of all contradictions. And that's why when we look at it from a structured materialistic point of view, reductionistic, atheistic, behavioristic, impersonalistic, deterministic, materialistic, we do not actually come to any real understanding of the world because we go round and round in circles. So reductionism is okay, but you can't apply it to everything. Atheism is always wrong because it's the first mistake in philosophy. Behaviorism, thinking that living entities have no internal states, but simply are the behavior they produce, which is all by chemicals, that's completely a fictitious concept, but it's part of our everyday thinking, of our modern intellectual world. Impersonalism, that everything is impersonal energies, that's also a part of our material thinking. And indeed there are impersonal energies, but there are also personal energies. Determinism is one of those things that is just the particular way that the Supreme Lord does things. He can also do things that are not deterministic. But some things he does deterministically and some things he does not do deterministically. And so one cannot simply mathematically tie everything up in a bag and say, because we know the laws and we know the equations, we can predict what will happen. So that's why that concept doesn't work. Materialism is one of the two basic options. You can see everything comes to the Supreme and we want to develop a spiritual outlook on things, or we can say that there is no God, there's nothing but matter, and we can try to, enjoy that matter. And then therefore we get more and more internal, we get more and more divorced from any understanding of anything, and we become lost chasing that spook light in the distant swamp, getting farther and farther away from the main path and not really realizing how far we've drifted. So materialism, mechanism, there are mechanisms, but not everything is mechanical. There is no evolution the way most people think of it. Things do change, but this is one of those things which is one of the main pillars of modern thinking, and you hear it used constantly, almost as if it was a invocation mantra, like the mantras that we see for the Ishopanishad or something. We invoke the sacred Darwin and the mantra of evolution and epiphenomenalism. That whenever we can't think of how something happens, we call it an epiphenomenon. And then everything doesn't count as an explanation unless you can put numbers on it, which is one of those bizarre modern habits of modern thinking, that things have to have numbers. If you look at it, it becomes really bizarre when you think about it. You look at your little iPhone or your tablet, and everything is numbers these days. How much do you like something? Is it a 1? Is it a 2? When you go to the hospital, how much does it hurt? Is it a 10? Is it a 9? And one speaker I was listening to was talking about, and you can rate famous literature. Is it a 4.5? Is Tolstoy's one of his books as good as something that was written by some modern author? And everything is numerical, and sometimes we stop to think about it. It's ridiculous, How can you numerize all these things? But we're constantly seeing it done. And every application that you see on your phone or on a tablet is all numbers, You choose this number or that number. When you go to a site, we know it's got a site address, an IP address, We know that we can turn the volume up from a 24 to 100, which is usually at the top. We have all these things. Everything is numerized, and we think if we can put a number to things, we've somehow gotten to the bottom of it. And this is why these tendencies of the way modern people think are very opposed to the tendencies that are actually there, where we understand the universe is a living, breathing thing, a mysterious thing. But it does have some important things that we should understand about it, that there is a spiritual path, and we can pay attention to it or not pay attention to it as we like. If we do, we become we understand things, we come out of the darkness. If we don't, we can rotate life after life, many, many different lifetimes, go through a difficult struggle for some kind of money, working our way through in this banyan tree, only to die and do it all over again in a different body, another country, with another language, another set of parents, etc., etc. So usually I try to break it up into little pieces, but somehow or another I had to just weld all those pieces together. So I'll stop at this point and ask if there are any questions about some of the things that I presented. That's why this chapter is called the Yoga of the Supreme Person, because when we understand how the Supreme Person connects to everything, then we begin to actually get a handle on what's happening in this world, how we relate to this world, and what will happen depending on what we do, what our choices will create in the future, how those choices will create a reality for us depending on whether we choose plan A or plan B. Yeah.
I'm just curious. I spend a lot of time reading. I read a lot of lately I've been reading a lot about like quantum mechanics. And some of these guys come into, I don't know, you seem pretty well read, like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens.
Right.
Yeah. Say no free will and
right.
Yeah. Some of the stuff is interesting, but what you said, the unified theory, the law of attraction, and it's just all energy. I mean, isn't it moving towards something? The question I'd like to know is, when would reincarnation end, if it does?
Well, it ends when we decide to connect our desires to the Supreme Lord. So most of the religions of the world have this idea that we should serve and love God. Whether you're talking to a rabbi or a priest, or you're talking to a preacher or whoever, or even an imam, probably they would agree that we should serve and love God. The problem is, of course, that nobody has any clue what that really means, and much less how to do it in a modern world where mostly we're distracted by all kinds of things, So this is the actual thing that ends reincarnation, when we come to the stage where we completely develop a desire to love God. Now, love of God is not something we have to get from an outside source. It's something we already have. But what's happened is that we have lots of wrong attitudes and material thinking that impedes or blocks that love of God. So it's not a thing we're getting, it's a thing we're removing the impediments to. And so when all those impediments are gone, and that can be done by the process we talk about here called bhakti yoga or devotional service, by doing that process, gradually, little by little, we chip away all that forgetfulness, that reticence, that fear, that distrust, and we become 100% sold on God again. And when we do that, then when we leave this body, we don't come back to the material world. That does not mean we don't have a body. We have a spiritual body. Even we have one now. But we are not identified with our spiritual body. Rather, like a driver in a, semi-trailer truck, we are inside a contraption, this thing. And when we leave this world finally, the real driver or the real self goes to the spiritual world where it has a form and it has a relationship with the Lord. And there, that relationship goes on in some kind of flavor. We are talking about different kinds of flavors. Technically, there's 5. There is the rasa of conjugal love, the rasa of parental affection, the rasa of friendship, the rasa of servitorship, and the rasa of what's the best way to put it? The rasa of neutrality, it's sometimes called. So that's what stops reincarnation. It doesn't stop our activity. It doesn't stop our personality. It doesn't stop things from happening. But we are not continuing with that in the material world. Now we're continuing with that in the spiritual world, which is a different location. And in the spiritual world, we're acting in our spiritual original form. And here we're acting in our virtual material form, which has all of its various problems. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you think it would be possible for the current Western conceptions to not necessarily be wrong, but to be immature, and that eventually it may come to be that a system is developed that is complete and can be a healthy outlook?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's, like I was saying, all these things that I was talking about, this rabid men squared, that some of these are not actually wrong. They're just wrong when they're applied too much and in the wrong place, The material scientists, they study various machinations of the way the material world works, and those can be useful and they can be done in a certain way. But where it all goes wrong is when it becomes part of a philosophy that nails the door shut to understanding spiritual life or the Supreme Being. That's where it goes wrong. Anytime you try to build a philosophy which doesn't somehow connect to the Supreme Being, that philosophy will not help anybody in the long run. And it may seem logically or mathematically consistent, but later on it will be discovered that it's not logically or mathematically consistent. So in our modern world, what counts as an explanation is reducing things to some laws. What counts as an explanation is throwing numbers at people. That's what counts as an explanation. But actually, that's not the only kind of explanations. We can count and use numbers. We can reduce things to some first principles. But to understand the basics of what's going on, we have to hear from the knowledge that's always been there. The knowledge that we're speaking is not new knowledge, it's not research knowledge. It's knowledge that's part of the universe and always has been. That's why we call it the absolute truth. However, this knowledge is not commonly known. That's certainly true. And that's why the Vedic literatures try to bring this knowledge to people who do not currently know it. And as you begin to dig into it, and you yourself evaluate it and try to come to terms with it, you begin to see that nothing else holds a candle to this. It subsums all the other aspects of it. So there's no harm in knowing about quantum physics or differential equations or Maxwell's laws of electrodynamics. There's no harm in knowing these things. But if one understands the purpose of life and uses those different pieces of knowledge in perspective with the real purpose of life, then those pieces of knowledge are helpful. Otherwise, those pieces of knowledge become like a stopgap alternative to spiritual life. And in that sense, they are the reflection in darkness that puts us farther and farther into the swamp, following that, mysterious orb of light. Yeah.
We have questions. I hope it's not questions. In a material body, we are observers.
Mm-hmm.
We're not actually who act. We assume that we are this body, but
Mm-hmm.
the body is under influence of material energies and demigods, and so we don't really do anything. So we have this material body here, and we don't do anything. In the spiritual body,
Mm-hmm.
what happens? We still observers.
No, we are not observing anything. That's the thing that is kind of hard for us to grasp. The physics, if we want to call it that, or metaphysics maybe is a better term, of the spiritual world and the material world, there's some similarities and there's some differences. One of the differences is that there is no difference between you and your body in the spiritual world. In the material world, there is a difference between you and your body. The body is like an aircraft carrier. Especially in the summer when all the flies and mosquitoes are landing on you, you can see that we're like an aircraft carrier, But inside there's a pilot of the aircraft carrier, or a captain, whatever you want to call him. So in the spiritual world, there's no such setup. The self and the body are one. There's no parts to it. It's one homogeneous thing. So we're acting, and that acting is an expression of our desire. And there's no material form that has to be animated. Here, there is a material form. So the soul is 1/10,000th the size of a tip of a hair located in the heart. And it is the pilot or the driver of the gross material body. So when the soul decides it wants to move the right arm, the supersoul witnesses the desire of the living entity and then actually makes the aircraft carrier or the robot move. So we hear yantra rudrani maya, this body is a machine. It's described that way in Bhagavad-gita, that it's a machine made of material energy. So, like any machine, we are not the machine, but we're driving the machine. But when we leave the machine behind and repatriate to the spiritual world, then we are in our original spiritual form, which is not a machine. It's an energy. It's called the internal, or rather the marginal energy of the Supreme. And there we can engage in pastimes and all those kind of things. And things work under a completely different physics there, because in the spiritual world things are unlimited. So in the spiritual world, if everything was constantly doing unlimited things in unlimited ways, pastimes would be kind of boring. So there is a kind of limitation in the spiritual world, but not the physical limitations that we experience here in the spiritual world. Things are limited, so it makes the pastimes interesting. So Krishna could just teleport from one place to another, but instead with the gopis they walk around and sometimes they dance. So he doesn't do that way. He accepts and creates limitations, but those limitations just create an interesting effect for the pastimes. Whereas here they're the ball and chains of the world that we live in. Here we're forced to do things a certain way, and that's because we made a mistake of coming here. And as prisoners in a prison house, we're not free to do what we want to do in the way we want to do it. We're in this, robot, and we've got to deal with the way the robot works. Does that help?
Well, I'm trying kind of to pick. I guess if we are in the spiritual world, it's like here we are conditioned, so we believe we are this body.
Right.
In a spiritual world, we also believe we are that body.
But we are.
We actually are.
We actually are. Right. In the spiritual world, we actually are the body. And the body is not earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. In the spiritual world, the body is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, which is eternity, knowledge, and bliss, like Krishna's body. It's made out of those three elements, Sat, Chit, and Ananda. It's eternal, it's knowledgeable, it's blissful. It's also Vigraha, so it has a form. We're not Casper the Friendly Ghost or something like that in the spiritual world. We actually have a form, and that's a very specific form. And we can change our form if we want to in the spiritual world, but generally we do not, because it's part of our rasa, or our relationship with the Supreme. And so that's the way things go on in the spiritual world. Where are we? We're overtime.
One more quick question, because I know
Okay.
you're overtime. Something interesting you just said, I just caught you say, because we made a mistake.
Yeah. So there's always plan A and plan B. If you're asking what the mistake was. Plan A and plan B. We have free will despite Sam Harris. Or that experiment done by Myers or whatever his name was, the free will is that we can either cooperate with and try to blend ourselves in the pastimes of the Supreme Lord, or we don't have to. We can ignore that whole thing. And when we do, though, that's option B, and we come here. The material world, because in the spiritual world it's impossible to ignore God. He's everywhere and he's center stage, and we wouldn't be happy there and they wouldn't be happy having us there. So to make everything work out, we come to this interesting and mysterious fun house here called the material world, where things aren't exactly what they seem, and nobody does exactly what they think they're doing, and things never last forever, and things just keep mutating, and nobody ever really gets happy, but they think that they're right around the corner from being happy. And we can do that. So this is those who make the mistake of thinking, well, I'm going to later on this whole business of being part of the entourage and pastimes of the Lord, I'd rather have my own pastimes. Okay, here we are. This is where you can have your own pastimes. Go for it, And after a while we see that it just doesn't work out, at this place, and its pastimes there's something really funky about them. And we decide, help, I want out. And then we discover the process of bhakti yoga, where we reverse millions of lifetimes of reincarnations of rejecting understanding of God, rejecting any desire to serve God, of being attracted by various temporary, glittery things of the material world that really don't do us any good. So that's the mistake.
Not choice, huh?
Yeah, we're here for a reason, though, and it wasn't the Supreme Lord forced us to come. We volunteered, and now we have to unvolunteer, and so it takes some while to get out of this place. All right, so probably we should cap it and move on to chanting. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. Hare Krishna.